including Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Central African Republic, and a whole host of others, including even North African country. So I am not surprised that still more overtures are being made. It is more like a scramble between the East and the West, and that's exactly what we are witnessing. So indeed, I'm not surprised that Russia is making overtures in Africa because there's a lot at stake.
But what does it come with? And I'm talking about Russia as a key security partner for Africa. Countries like Russia and China have been known to, in fact, that's what they often position themselves as not getting involved in countries' domestic affairs, but they've also been singled out as providers of weaponry, which continues to fuel conflicts on the African continent. So a bit of a muddled picture if we're going to say they're going to help silence the guns.
Well, I do know, for example, in Mali and Burkina Faso, the Russians have come in to help counter the threat of terrorism, especially after the departure of the French and the Americans, especially also in Niger. But I must say that hasn't been enough to stop the violence. Almost on daily basis, we are seeing more audacious, more attacks by particularly Jenim and Kasiba Masina, the terrorist groups operating very prevalent in Burkina Faso and Mali. We are seeing them stage more attacks by the day. And basically what this means is the intervention of the Russians hasn't been enough to stop the violence.
I'm curious as to the global security architecture and the role that Russia can play. You spoke about the Sahel region, for instance, what Russia has been doing. Yet in the past, the Wagner Group, which has been said to have close ties with, Russia's oligarchy, has also been used or been instrumental in some of the conflicts in the Sahel region. So what positioning, what posturing does Russia now take up at this particular summit? And murmurings that it should make to be seen as the security partner to be with.
Well, definitely, it's quite obvious that the Russians are trying to paint a certain picture. They are trying to paint a picture to the effect that they are a more reliable partner. They are not going to ask for too much before giving. They are not going to influence your foreign policy. They are not going to influence your economic policy before giving. And they want to be seen as coming to help, But of course, there are some benefits to this because we do know that in West Africa, the Russians have taken over certain mines. They mine natural resources in exchange for security support that they have given these, countries. We also know for a fact that the Russians, through the Wagner, have been engaged in combat missions, particularly in West Africa against these terrorist groups. So surely the Russians want to portray a reliable partner kind of relationship, but whether that is working to counter the threats posed by the terrorist groups and other non-state actors in the various regions within the continent is what we are unable to tell. But surely the figures paint a rather disturbing picture. In Burkina Faso, which is very close to Ghana, almost on daily basis, we are recording more attacks, some of them too close for comfort, very close to the Ghana border. Periodic basis, we have thousands of Burkinabes streaming into Ghana in the thick of the night because their communities have been attacked. All this despite the presence of the Russians. We also do know, and it's been recorded, particularly in Mali, that the Russians, through Wagner, have engaged in human rights violations. There's a lot of evidence that has been documented by even the Human Rights Watch. But the same can also be said of the Western countries, especially France, that was there before the Russians came in. So I think it is a very difficult situation for many African leaders. It's like getting caught between a brick or rock and a hard place.
And especially now, if sorry to jump in, because I'm thinking of what is happening now as we speak, negotiations between Kigali and Kinshasa, spearheaded by the United States, which itself has AFRICOM on African soil and would want to entrench further its own security personnel presence.
Well, I mean, surely the Americans would still want to assert some level of influence despite the coming in of the Russians. They've not been comfortable with the gains made by the Russians lately, especially the popular support the Russians are getting on the ground. I mean, we've seen a lot of protests and a lot of celebrations in favor of the Russians. We've seen instances where the military takes over government and people come out in the thousands waving Russian flags and all that. So the Americans are not so pleased about it yet. They are also doing the very best they can, mostly through economic means, to keep some level of influence within the continent, because there's a lot at stake for the Americans. There are a lot of American companies operating all over Africa, and it's in their best interest, strategic interest for that matter, to ensure that influence remains. So, like I indicated at the beginning of the interview, look, it is more like a scramble. Okay, yes. Any means possible, any opportunity that comes, the Russians or Americans would have to grab it, and that is exactly what we're witnessing. And I remember what the Zambian president said. He said, look, the fact that we're friends with the Russians doesn't make us enemies to the Americans. We need to push what is in the best interest of our countries. We can be friends with both the East and the West. So Ghana, for example, is non-aligned. I mean, we're not supposed to take sides. So I see a lot of African countries trying to play that game of, dealing with both the Russians and the Americans.
And I don't know how fair this is, and I'm saying this based on the criticism leveled at it and the actions that it's taken, and I'm pointing a finger precisely at President Ruto of Kenya, his involvement with the U.S., particularly its presence in Haiti, how it's been seen. So let's talk about the pros and cons of that. Non-alignment is something that's gotten South Africa into hot water, particularly while it takes a very strong stance on what is happening in the Middle East, the Israeli attacks on Gaza. So if we're talking about the shifting of tectonic plates and the importance of further entrenching multilateralism, how important a chance is this, particularly for the global south? Because we know the BRICS countries are going to be there, along with other African countries. South Africa is head of the G20, and there's going to be the upcoming G7 meeting soon.
Well, Africa has a lot to benefit from the Americans. It has a lot to benefit from the Russians. Let's not forget that we're getting a lot of Russian technology in our defense industry, in our trade and commerce. We also rely to a very large extent on grain products from Russia and other countries near the Russian mainland. I remember when Russia invaded Ukraine, and there was a blockade of the grains movement, how pathetic it became, so to speak, for many African countries that relied largely on grains from Russia and Ukraine. Okay, so it is in the best interest of the a lot of countries within Africa to strike a balance, to be very meticulous for that matter in their relationship between the East and the West. I remember about 2 years ago, Ghana's president was in Washington. He met then Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. And unfortunately, before the international media, he spoke about the activities of the Russians in Burkina Faso and thought that it is a security risk to Ghana. It wasn't well received at all. I mean, a lot of Ghanaians, including myself, spoke against it because it presented to us a diplomatic nightmare between Ghana and, of course, Burkina Faso. Later, the Ghana government realized that, hey, it was a monumental mistake. So they reached out to the Burkinabes, first through the national security minister, who went there and pacified the Gauls, so to speak. Then later, President Nana Dankwa Akufo-Addo followed up and apologized to the junta for those remarks that he made. And the Russians, of course, were not also happy about that. So we need to maintain that non-aligned posture going forward.
Adib, I need to leave it here, but I really do thank you for your time and your insights. Much appreciated. Adib Sani, foreign policy and security analyst based in Ghana's capital, Accra. And of course, while we're speaking about this, I'm sure you would have heard by now that the AFDB's new president has been appointed, and that is Mauritania's former finance minister.
Africa Update on Channel Africa with Lulu Kabu.
Protesters in Ghana have accused the country's president of violating the constitution and interfering in the independence of the judiciary. Eric Mawena Egbeta, the opposition protesters calling for the reinstatement of Tokonu.
The presidency and the president and all of its spokespersons around the seat of government have had one narrative and one narrative only, that no constitutional breaches have occurred in the process up until now, which has resulted in the suspension of the Chief Justice. In fact, it does appear the government has already communicated to these protesters that we're not interested in having the Chief Justice return and fill her position until the determination of the matter. We believe that she must remain suspended for the investigations to take place, after which the final determination will inform whether or not she returns.
Africa Update with Lulu Kabu, 12 to 1 p.m. Central African Time. At the forefront, the most pressing issues on Africa World Hour with Sipiso Magweta.
Channel Africa.
At 24 minutes to 10, the most pressing issues, and of course the most current, the most immediate, the most relevant. So we are talking world hunger in just a moment, but just a quick one. As I mentioned earlier on before the break, Sidi Ould Tah, who formerly served as Mauritania's finance minister, was elected as president of the African Development Bank during the bank's annual meeting earlier on in Abidjan in Ivory Coast. So he replaces Akinwumi Eresina, a Nigerian economist who will step down in September after completing the maximum 2 5-year terms in office. So let's go back to our story of the moment. We speak to Mark Hayward, and this is about this issue: South Africa grappling with deepening hunger and widening inequality. One voice remaining steadfast in calling out the systemic roots of the crisis is Mark Hayward, a prominent human rights and social justice activist. He's long argued that hunger is not merely a humanitarian concern, but a deeply political issue shaped by policy choices, governance, and accountability. To explore this further, we're joined now by Mark Hayward. Mark, a very good evening to you, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Good evening, and thank you for having me again.
So if we just look back a year ago, what are the figures and just how much more has inequality and food security widened between the classes?
Well, as you said in your introduction, hunger and malnutrition is in fact getting worse in South Africa. Just a few days ago, a report was published that revealed that 155 children had died of malnutrition between January and early May of 2025. In fact, the figures are probably much higher because these are officially recorded statistics taken from public hospitals where the cause of death was given as malnutrition. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg, because we know that about 1/3 of South Africa's population lives on a spectrum of hunger. Some people are short of food or have no food all of the time. Some people are short of the food at the end of the month. Some people are short of the food because they're seasonal workers on farms and wine yards and so on and so on. And I guess the great tragedy of these facts is that they don't exist because South Africa is a country that doesn't produce enough food, or because South Africa is a country that is undergoing a drought. In fact, South Africa produces a surplus of food and exports a large amount of food. So, as you said in your introduction, they exist largely because of structural inequalities, failures of the health system, and basically the fact that millions of poor people in South Africa simply can't afford to buy enough food to live properly.
And of course, an indictment, given the fact that if you talk about the political transformative ideology that we're being sold when we go to the polls, is that we are ensuring that we are uprooting those systemic inequalities. And COVID-19, as the pandemic showed us very glaringly just how far apart the line is between the haves and the have-nots. So what have been the major failings from a governance point of view?
Well, in South Africa, there is a constitutional right of access to sufficient food and water for everybody in the country. And remember, our constitution is our supreme law. When it comes to children, the right to basic nutrition is even stronger, because every child has a right to basic nutrition, and the language of the Constitution when it comes to children doesn't qualify it with talk of available resources or progressive realization or something. It just simply says that every child, as we are talking now, should have basic nutrition, sufficient nutrition to meet that child's developmental needs. The problem is that government has just had a completely laissez-faire approach to food and hunger in South Africa, and consequently the kind of hunger divide has got wider and wider, and it falls on kind of class grounds, and of course class grounds overlap with historical race grounds. So the vast majority of people who are hungry are black, and the vast majority of people are women and children who are being most severely affected. Now, government could do something about it. As you know, I'm somebody who's fought on the right of access to health as well, and got government to drive down the price of medicines. Well, the same principle applies here, which is that they could intervene in the food market, and they could say that we are going to control the price of certain essential foodstuffs that, for example, are needed to ensure the full development of children. Let me, as an aside, just say that 29% of South African children by the age of 5 are stunted. They have experienced malnutrition sufficiently badly that they are stunted, and that stunting will affect their whole life's development.
And Mark, let me jump in there. As we speak about that, I'm an MNCH activist, so I was just looking at the figures. If we're saying only 1 in 5 infants under the age of 6 are exclusively breastfed, so that is a solution. And I know not all parents have access to food to be able to breastfeed their children. I'm just saying some of these solutions are up to us as people and not necessarily the system. But at the same time, I'm wondering about the role of public-private partnerships. If we're saying 10 million tons of food goes to waste every year, there certainly is a problem. And we've seen it in restaurants, how much food gets wasted when it simply could be given to people without.
No, you're absolutely right. So let's take the question of breastfeeding. We should be doing more to assist mums to breastfeed. We should be doing more to promote breastfeeding, and we should be doing more to control those companies like Nestle that unethically promote milk substitutes to people, formula milk and so on, which have, as you know, a detrimental effect on children's growth and development. So there is one example you've given it. Another example you've just mentioned is that we waste 10 million tons of food a year. That is calculated to amount to about 40 billion meals. It's 1/3 of all the food that we produce. Now, in some countries, there are laws that make food wastage illegal, or rather make it obligatory that big retail food companies ensure that food is redistributed to people and to NGOs and CBOs and people who need it. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, what's most shocking about South Africa, about hunger and malnutrition in our country, is that there are a plethora of solutions to it. And we seem to just lack the political will at both a governmental but also at a corporate level to take this problem seriously. And my feeling is that that's because the people who are most affected are poor, are silent, and are not screaming about...
And Mark, let me put my foot in it here, because it is a topical one. The fact that we are speaking about refugees in the United States at the moment because there is the accusation of farm killings. And the figures here say that farm workers suffer severe seasonal hunger, rising from less than 50% in the summer to over 85% in winter. So that's something that's going to be in the offing now. And it happens at the same time while the United States has cut aid to South Africa for some of these schemes. But it's not just the United States, it's other countries as well. So then what is the point of having, ODA if countries want to get involved in sovereign domestic policy, but yet at the same time they pull out the very aid that could be saving some of these people who actually are in fact the victims? Yeah.
Well, no, that's a very, very good point. I mean, you're the author of people's miseries, and you turn a blind eye to unnecessary suffering. I mean, seasonal hunger simply means that during the times when wine farms and so on harvest grapes in the Western Cape for wine, or when you're needing to tend to crops, people are employed and people eat. They don't eat sufficiently, by the way. But, during times when it's winter and there's less work on farms, then people are laid off, they become unemployed, and they're unable to afford or get food in the agricultural baskets of our country. It's just wrong that should be the case. And we have this kind of selective morality that you talk about, which focuses on some people, but ignores other people, and seems to suggest that some people are more important than others.
And I'm just thinking about tariffs, for instance. I mean, we are one of the largest exporters of wine. We have beautiful wine, and lots of tourists come to, say, the Western Cape and other countries to sample South African wine. And you wonder, even as a government, why not funnel some of, the taxes, the export taxes, towards feeding schemes for particularly farm workers who work these farms?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of the examples that you are giving are just evidence that there is no shortage of interventions, policy measures, programmatic measures that are available to alleviate the hunger crisis that exists in South Africa. And, if I was the Minister of Tourism at the moment, then I would try to excite tourists, not just in the beauties and the wonders of our country, of which there are many, but also in the vision and the developmental path of equality and in our human rights. And we know, there are plenty of good people in the world. I mean, our constitution is celebrated worldwide. So, and every tourist who comes here knows about Nelson Mandela, knows about our struggle, how we overcome our struggle, and they often come here because they feel in some way invested in it. Well, we should be saying to them, it didn't end in 1994. It's not just a historic thing. Help us carry that vision forward and realize that vision. You know, we could make poverty alleviation and
A sustainability
transformation
issue, yeah.
a sustainability. We could make it exciting. We could make it a sexy part of tourism if we were imaginative and creative enough.
Mark, I
But
suspect
instead,
you and I are launching a movement tonight. We must just get together, work out the finer details.
you've
But-
given me some good ideas.
But I really appreciate that. But I honestly, seriously, I would love this to be something that Africa World Hour helps to pioneer, because I feel very, very strongly about it. And I really appreciate your time in speaking to us. We definitely will be in touch. Mark Hayward, South African human rights and social justice activist, speaking to us about the alarming levels of food insecurity and hunger here in South Africa.
Zilipendwa na Abedi Jean de la Croix.
Mara ya kwanza kabisa uliingia studio ulikuwa ni mwaka gani?
Ya, nakumbuka mara kwanza nimeingia studio hapa South Africa.
Vizuri sana.
Ilikuwa ni mwaka wa 2016-17 kama sisahau.
Swali kidogo la kizushi hivi hapo Durban watu wanafahamu kama wewe ni mwanamuziki?
Ya, hapa Durban watu wengi wananifahamu kwamba mimi ni msanii ambaye anafanya vyema kwenye mambo ya muziki.
Okay, vizuri sana. Hongera sana kwa hilo. Naam, tuzungumzie sasa albamu yako ambayo unapanga kuitoa hivi karibuni. Albamu unatoa lini?
Ya, albamu itakuwa available, itakuwa tayari next week Saturday, itakuwa tayari.
Albamu inaenda na ngoma ngapi?
Albamu inaenda na muziki 17.
Zilipendwa kila Jumamosi kuanzia saa 12 kamili majira ya Afrika ya Kati hadi saa 1 kamili majira ya Afrika ya Kati.
Africa at Play with Neto, NETO chairman.
The Confederation of African Athletics, the CAA president, Mr. Hamad Kalkaba Malboum, talk to us about the state of athletics in Africa as it stands, and what picture are you looking at 5 years later?
Yeah, athletics in Africa is strong. We are able to organize our major events in time. Like this year, we will have the under-20 and under-18 African Championship in Nigeria. Next year, we will have the senior in Ghana. In 2027, we will go back to Algeria to organize the under-18 and under-20. And then 2028, we will have the senior championship in Gaborone in Botswana. Well, by this program, we can increase our performance. And at the same time, we are considering the fact that within the British Federation, they are identifying young talent every year within the national program, within the scholarship championship. And so the athletics in Africa is in good standard.
Live every Saturday and Sunday from 2 to 5 p.m. Central African Time. At the forefront, the most pressing issues on Africa World Hour with Sipiso Magwetu.
Channel Africa.
And the last 8 minutes of Africa World Hour certainly has seemed like a very short hour this evening. So much to talk about, so many interesting discussions and, of course, guests. This time we speak about the Trump administration launching a sweeping campaign targeting Harvard University, seeking to block its enrollment of international students, review billions in federal contracts, and redirect research funding, all amid accusations of campus anti-Semitism. These moves are part of a broader effort to reshape U.S. higher education and challenge what they see as liberal dominance in academia. To explore the political and social ramifications of this unfolding story, we on the line to Professor Mojabaulu Olufunke Okomie, political scientist at Brooklyn College and expert on U.S. politics and global affairs. A very good evening to you, Prof. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us again. I know when this attack on particularly American universities and in relation to the actions of students against Israel was gaining momentum. We spoke to you about this. So there have been new changes, but we'll look at what's happening in Harvard in the sense that it's decided to, in light of this, hold off on its visa interviews and also possibly start looking at the social media platforms of prospective students. Is this something that we're likely to see across the United States?
I think the scrutiny that was said to be planned for visa-seeking students is a general thing. It's not restricted to Harvard students. And, the way I see what's happening to Harvard is that it seems as if the strategy is to go after the oldest university in the United States and the wealthiest. And so once you take Harvard down, then, it would be easy to also do the same to other institutions that are not as wealthy, not as influential, and not as famous, and not as old. I also think that what is being done is an assault on, academic freedom. It's a really serious challenge against democracy, because a lot of what is being imposed is to restrict speech, to monitor speech, to monitor access to information and people's freedom to, consume whatever information they see fit. And also, as a person who is African, and I teach women's studies, I teach political science, and I teach African studies. There are aspects of what is being done beyond Harvard that is a challenge against my own freedom to teach what I see to be appropriate and to be important to giving a comprehensive and also excellent education.
As you say, Prof, you know that Harvard is the oldest and possibly the most affluent, but this is not the first time that academia faces such crackdowns. In the 60s, 1960s, the protests, and the 1990s saw the whole issue around political correctness. So I want to look at this wave of ideological battles and cultural war. What is it likely to do in dismantling the bastions of liberal thought? This is a Trump era, but it surely will do something to the American, fabric of society for, other administrations to come further. So talk to me about the shift that you're seeing, and can Americans fight back and fight for the America that they believe they deserve and want?
Well, so there are aspects of what's happening that are not new. As you've said, you can see elements of what's happening now in the McCarthy era attacks on people who were labeled communist and socialists and enemies of the American state. There are aspects of what's happening also in terms of the hostility of higher education to embracing a truly comprehensive multicultural education. Because I think even before Trump, Africa is kind of not treated with the proper respect that it deserves in the academy in terms of devoting resources to research, devoting resources to funding departments where Africa is taught seriously in the disciplines. And also, there are elements of bias and white dominant, racist kinds of framing of what is happening in the academy that I don't think comes from just Trump. What is happening now is putting these negative tendencies in a very weaponized, very, I think, fascist even.
So I want to talk about that.
Attack on higher education and on what this administration is calling DEI, which is everything that is not conventional, focused on white thought.
Okay, Prof, we are running out of time, and I feel bad about this because this is a very important discussion. Operationally, though, how would that work? How do you maintain institutional freedom or independence while actually having to deal with the federal implications of this? Because if you're going to surveil students who are potential cohorts for the university, can you do that without the government?
Well, so the government is saying that it's going to do this. I doubt that they'll be able to do it as comprehensively as they want to. I also think that this is going to scare a lot of students who would have preferred to come to the US away, because nobody wants to be under that kind of scrutiny. Now, inside the institutions of learning and among faculty, there are actually attempts to build coalitions that push back against this. So there are mutual academic defense consortium that's been formed. The heads of universities, administrators of universities have also come out to make proclamation about their opposition to these attacks on higher education. And then there are a lot of lawsuits. Actually, the last time I looked, the Trump administration has lost about 80% of the lawsuits brought against it, not only for academic freedom issues and these assaults on immigrant students in general. So this is a battle the administration cannot win. But there's a kind of cold, chilling effect, because people will self-police who don't want to have any kind of trauma and any kind of attacks from the government. And this is not good for higher education. It's not good for democracy. It's not good for America's reputation in the world. It's very damaging.
Expression or
yes.
Literature.
It's not good for democracy, Yeah. This is not showing democracy.
It's such a pity, but I really do appreciate your time, as always, for being free with it and sharing your opinion, your views, your experience of what is happening, particularly at American universities at this very interesting time. Much appreciated your time and your insights. Professor Mojabaulu Olufunke Okome, political scientist at Brooklyn College and a respected voice on global governance, migration and international education. Brings the time to just a minute after 10. Thank you so much for joining Africa World Hour. Do enjoy the rest of your listening here on Channel Africa. Up next, Shayla Nukumana with Hotlines.
Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.